Hi, it's Rob. Welcome to the next video in the AWS Amplify playlist. In the last video, we discussed knowledge and software prerequisites for successfully following along in this series, as well as installed the AWS Amplify CLI. In this video, we'll be scaffolding the React application using the Create React App CLI. Now, before we get started, I just want to level set on expectations for this video. Since the focus of this playlist is on using AWS Amplify and not on building a front-end web app, this video won't be an in-depth tutorial on using React. It'll be more of a hands-on demo on how to build the app, which you can follow along with. So if you're looking for an actual course on React, I highly recommend the Udemy course, React, the Complete Guide by Maximilian Schwarzmüller. To get started, I created a GitHub repo for the project and cloned it to my local machine. Then I launched VS Code in the local repos directory. And as you can see, the repo only includes a gitignore and readme file at this time. So I'll jump back over to the terminal and scaffold the React app by executing the following command: npx create react app contacts app, where contacts app is the name of the React application I'd like Create React App to scaffold. Now I'll change directory into the project folder and execute npm start to ensure the scaffolding was successful. And here we see the default React application being served on localhost 3000. Now I'll jump back over to VS Code and do a little cleanup on this default application. I'll start by expanding the source folder and deleting the app.test.js file, the logo SVG, the report web vitals.js, and the setup.test.js file. Then I'll expand the public folder and delete everything except for the index.html file. Then I'll go into the app.css file, delete the contents and save the file, then open the app.js file. Here I'll delete the first line, which imports the logo SVG we just deleted, and then delete all the code between the opening and closing header tag. I'll also remove the class name attribute from the div and the header and save the file. Next, I'll go into the index.css file and delete the contents and open the index.js file. Here, I'll delete the import for the web vitals, remove React strict mode, and delete the call to execute report web vitals. Finally, I'll go into the index.html file and do a bit of cleanup. I'll save the file, jump back over to the browser, and now we see our app is reloaded with the contacts app in the title and no content on the page. And since this is a JavaScript app, I'll open up the console and ensure there are no errors present. Now, with the app successfully scaffolded, I'll go ahead and push these changes up to Git as my initial commit. Now, before I jump back over into VS Code and start writing the code for the application, I'm going to create a new branch for my common components that I'll be building in React. Then inside the project's public folder, I'm going to add a favicon and an image folder, which contains the site's logo. Then I'll jump over into VS Code and inside the source folder, create a new folder for my React components. And inside the components folder, I'll create another new folder for my common components, and then add files for the site nav and the site footer. Inside the site nav component, I'll add a site nav function, which will just return an H1 with the text site nav, and then export the component. And in the site footer, I'll do something similar, this time creating the site footer function, adding the site footer text, and returning the component. Now, in order to use these components in our site, I'll jump into the app.js file and import them. And then down in the app function, I'll add elements for each. And save the file. Now if I start the app again, we see our site nav and site footer components rendered on the page. Now for this site, I'll be using the React Bootstrap framework to style the components. React Bootstrap replaces the Bootstrap library with custom-built components for React apps, but maintains the Bootstrap look and feel. So to install React Bootstrap, I'll jump into a terminal and run npm install React Bootstrap and Bootstrap. Now I need to jump over to VS Code and make some changes to the app.js and index.js files to utilize the React Bootstrap components. In the app.js file, I'll add an import for the Bootstrap min CSS, and in the index.js file, I'll do the same. Now I'll restart the application, and when the page reloads, we see that our font has changed, so we know that React Bootstrap and Bootstrap have been applied. So now what I'd like to do is put an actual nav bar on the site. So I'll head over to the React Bootstrap documentation, click into Components, and then scroll down and find the nav bar. And we can see in this basic example that they're returning a component which is wrapped in a nav bar element. Then inside the nav bar element, there's a wrapping container, and then the sub-elements for the nav bar. If we look at the imports at the top, we'll see we need a container, a nav bar, and possibly a nav bar dropdown for our site. So I'm actually not going to have a nav bar dropdown, so I'll just copy these three imports and jump back over to VS Code, and then at the top of the site nav component file, I'll paste those in. Now I'll delete the H1 that we had as a placeholder, add a semantic HTML header element just to wrap the nav bar in the header, and then I'll add the nav bar element from React Bootstrap. Inside the nav bar, I'll add a container, and then I'll paste in the rest of the nav bar elements. So I'll save this, jump back into the browser, and now we see we have our nav. Now I'll jump in and do the footer. So here I'll start by importing a React Bootstrap container, deleting our placeholder, and then adding the elements for the footer. I'll save that, jump back into the browser, and now we have our header and footer displayed on the page. Now I want to turn my attention to the home page for the site. So inside the components folder, I'll create a new folder named home, and inside of that, I'll create a new file for the home component, and then add the boilerplate code for the home page function and export it. I'll add the import for the React Bootstrap container, and then add the container component. Going back to the Bootstrap documentation and looking at the grid system, we'll see that in addition to containers, we have rows and calls. So in this example, they've added a container with a child of a row and a child of a call. I'll be using similar elements to lay out the home page on the site, so I'll copy the imports for the row and the call and jump back into VS Code, and then add the imports at the top. I'll start by adding a row and then a call, which has a React Bootstrap image whose source points to the logo file that I added in the public image folder. Now, I'll need to add the import for the React Bootstrap image, and then jump down and add my second call. and then add the rest of the code for the page, which in this case, I'm just adding some lorem ipsum text. Now I'll jump over to the app.js file, import the component, and add it between the site header and site footer. I'll save the app.js file and jump back into the browser. Oh, and we see we have an error because I forgot to import the button element from React Bootstrap. So let's fix that. I'll save this, go back to the browser, and now we see our home page. Now I'll turn my attention to the login page. So inside the components folder, I'll create a new folder. I'll call this auth, create a new file for the login page component. I'll add the boilerplate, then a container with a row and an H1 element, and then a row for the form. Jumping back over to the React Bootstrap documentation and on the forms page, you'll see they have a form component with various form elements that you could add within the form. I'll be using some of these in the login form, so I'll grab the import for the form, jump back into VS Code, and import the form from React Bootstrap. So here I'll add the form, and inside the form elements. So I've started with a form group, which has a form label and a form control for the email address, another form group for the password, and a submit button. Now I'll add the import for the button and save the page. And now I'll move on to the register page. So in the auth folder, I'll create a new file, add the boilerplate, import the container from React Bootstrap, and add the container element. Inside the container, I'll add a row for the header, and then a row for the form. I'll go ahead and add the imports, and then build out the form. Here I've added a form group for the email address, a form group for the password, and a form group for the password confirmation, and finally a register button. Now, one more thing I want to do is jump back over to the site nav component and add a nav link to the register page. Now, if I save this and jump back in the browser, we see we have our login and register links, but if I click on them, I'm still on the home page. So now we need to implement routing in React so that when I click on a link, the appropriate content is displayed on the page. So for that, we need to jump into a terminal and run npm install react router dom to install the React Router DOM package. Now I'll jump back into VS Code, head over to the app.js file, and import route and routes from React Router DOM. Now down in the app function, I'm actually going to get rid of the homepage element and add a routes element. And inside the routes element, I'll add routes to path star and path slash with an exact match to route to the home page. Then I'll import the login page and the register page, and then add routes for them. Now, before we could jump in the browser and test out the routing, we need to head over to the index.js page and import browser router from React Router DOM. Then down in the render, we'll wrap the app in a browser router component, save the file, then head over to the browser. And we see our home page. And now if we click on the login link, we're taken to the login page. And if we click the register link, we're taken to the home page. So something doesn't look right here. So let's jump back into VS Code and head over to the site nav. And we see that the href for the nav link on the register is pointing to the root route. So we'll change this to register and save the page. Go back to the browser and click register again. And this time we're taken to the registration page. At this point, I've written quite a bit of code here, probably more than I had wanted to do in the common components branch, but I did get a bit carried away. So I'm going to go ahead and commit this code and push it up to the repo. Then I'll jump over to the repo, create a pull request, and just go ahead and merge the changes. All right, and we see our changes were added. So jump back into the terminal. And pull the updates into the main branch. Now I want to focus my attention on building out the contacts list page. So I'll create a new branch for contacts, jump into VS Code, and in the components folder, create a new folder for the contacts component. Then I'll create the contacts component file. And add the boilerplate code. Then I'll add a container with a child row and column. Then add another row which will hold the contacts. Jumping over to the React Bootstrap documentation, I'll be using a modified version of their cards component to display the contacts. Then back in the code, I'll add a column with a card which contains contact information. Inside the card, there's a card image which points to the source of a contact1 ping file in the image folder. And until we build the site out using dynamic content, I've added 3 contact images to the image folder. Then in the card body, there's some details for the contact. Now save the file, jump over to the app.js, import the contacts page, then add a route. I'll save this and jump back in the browser, and if I go to localhost 3000/contacts, we now see our contact on the contacts page. So I'm just going to jump back into VS Code and add a couple more contacts. I'll save the file, jump back into the browser, and now we see our 3 contacts listed. So that completes scaffolding the React application. We'll come back and make some modifications to the app when we start implementing Amplify. So I'll just go ahead and push the changes up to Git and merge them into the main branch. And there's our contacts component. And our local main is updated. In the next video, we'll begin to implement AWS Amplify. I hope to see you there.